Hello, my name is Mary Ames Mitchell. Welcome to my new video series about two 19th century human rights activists. Charles Gordon Ames was a Unitarian minister from New England, and his second wife, Fanny Baker Ames, was a school teacher from upstate New York. And that desk you see right behind me belonged to Charles once upon a time. These people dedicated their entire lives to uplifting the human condition as abolitionists, suffragists, labor and social reformers, Unitarians, and yes, supporters of the Temperance Movement. They defined the word liberals. As I researched them, I was surprised to learn how those movements were so interconnected, just like they are today. I've been a school teacher, a graphic designer, and now, obviously, I'm writing historical and genealogical stories about my family. You can check out the books I've written already on Amazon. So you've already found my YouTube channel. Thanks for joining me. These videos were inspired by last year's 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And this month, March, is Women's History Month. So I'm even more inspired to get these videos out. Honestly, I knew very little about women's suffrage. And then I got a call last year from the Massachusetts State Police Museum in Grafton, Massachusetts, asking me if I had any photographs of my great-great-grandmother Fanny. So I wanted to know why, and I wanted to know more about the movement. Not only was Fanny honored in Massachusetts, but her daughter, Alice Vivian Ames Winter, was honored in Minnesota. Her name is on a monument of 25 suffragettes at the Capitol building in St. Paul. I've broken the story into 5 parts to keep each video under 45 minutes. Part 1 explains how Charles and Fanny met in Ohio and how they became human rights activists. Part 2 introduces the cluster of Unitarians, abolitionists, and suffragists with whom Charles involved himself in Boston in 1859, 2 years before the Civil War broke out. Part 3 takes newlyweds Charles and Fanny to California, where the women's rights movement was just taking root, then to Philadelphia in time for the Panic of 1873. Part 4 describes Charles and Fanny's participation in social reform in Philadelphia and then Boston. And Part 5 describes the suffragists' final push to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920. Both Charles and Fanny lived to see the results of their anti-slavery efforts, but only Fanny witnessed the ratification of the 19th Amendment, a privilege that even Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone sadly missed. Julia Frances Baker was born in Canandaigua, New York in 1840, and always known as Fanny. Canandaigua sits alongside the industrial canal and river system that includes the Erie Canal. Fanny would grow up knowing all about factories, which is how she became concerned with labor conditions. Fanny's father, Increase Baker, was a farmer when he was young and a coal measurer when he was older. His family and his wife Julia Ann Canfield's family, back in the 1600s, immigrated to New England from Old England. They became Baptists and moved to Rhode Island, then to upstate New York as farmers. Deacon Benjamin Baker Jr. enlisted in the Army of the Revolution when he was 52 years old. He died in 1778 from sickness. 2 of his sons also served. Fanny was the only girl, sandwiched between 2 older and 2 younger brothers. All we know about her childhood is that it was not a happy one. her future husband Charles would write, "She has lived and suffered and bravely borne herself through the most saddening domestic shadows which can cloud a daughter's plate." Canandaigua is 42 miles directly west of Seneca Falls, also part of the Industrial Canal System. Seneca Falls is where in 1848, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and some 300 others held the first Women's Rights Convention. Today, Seneca Falls is the location of the Women's Rights National Historic Park. Fanny was only 8 years old when the convention took place, so I doubt she attended. But growing up in upstate New York, she watched the women's rights movement gather steam. Most of the early organizers had been fighting together for abolition since William Lloyd Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1933, 7 years before Fanny was born. Later in life, Fanny and Charles will get to know many of the suffragists well. Their daughter Alice will write, "The early group of suffragists were among the dear friends of the family, Lucy Stone, Mrs. Livermore, and dear Mrs. Howe, who was a member of my father's congregation. And I remember my father and Susan B. doing a charade while the rest of us sat on the floor and shrieked with laughter." These 4 women were close in age. Lucy Stone was born in 1818 and Julia in 1819. Mary Livermore and Susan B. Anthony were born in 1820. We will tell you more about the first 3 when this story takes us to Boston. Meanwhile, in upstate New York, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony served Fanny as serious role models. Lucretia Coffin Mott, who helped organize the convention in 1848, was 47 years older than Fanny and one of the oldest suffragettes. As a Quaker, her parents taught her that all people were equal under God, men and women. She was born on Nantucket Island, where her father worked as a ship captain. The family moved to Boston when Lucretia was 10. When she was 15, the family moved to Philadelphia. And when she was 17, she married her father's business partner, James Mott. You will notice that the efforts of most of the suffragettes we meet were supported by these women's husbands. James Mott sounds like a pretty decent guy. He and Lucretia had 5 children together. When Lucretia's father died and left her mother with a mountain of debt, James helped the family out. In 1833, the couple joined Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. In those days, there was a stigma against women speaking in public to mixed-sex crowds. So that same year, Lucretia helped found a female anti-slavery society. James backed his wife in all her endeavors. According to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the women's rights movement was launched in 1840, the year Fanny was born, at the World Anti-Slavery Society Convention in London. Lucretia and James Mott attended, along with future suffragists Sarah and Angelina Grimke from South Carolina, and Bostonians Mary Grew, Wendell Phillips and his wife Anne Terry Green, and newlyweds Henry and Elizabeth Stanton. Upon arrival in England, the female American delegates learned that they were not welcome. The Americans had misinterpreted the invitation to Friends of the Slave. They thought that meant women and men, not just men. Anne Green, who was 17 years younger than Lucretia and also a delegate, turned to her husband, Wendell Phillips, a Harvard attorney, and said, "Don't be shilly-shally. Appeal the case." Phillips spoke up as the convention opened. He scolded the organizers for participating in unnecessary conflict. Then he said, "Massachusetts has for several years acted on the principle of admitting women to an equal seat with men in the deliberate bodies of the anti-slavery societies. We stand here in consequence of your invitation, and knowing our custom, as it must be presumed you did, we had a right to interpret friends of the slave to include women as well as men. Ultimately, the women were allowed into the hall, but they had to sit separately and could not speak to the crowd. Many years after that, Elizabeth Cady Stanton will write in the History of Women's Suffrage, which she co-authored with Susan B. Anthony, Wendell Phillips's efforts provided the essential momentum that started the women's rights movement. During the hubbub, Lucretia Mott bonded with Elizabeth Cady Stanton over the issue of women not being able to speak at the convention. They vowed that once they returned to the United States, they would organize their own convention to discuss and improve women's rights. It would take them 8 years to formulate. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was 22 years younger than Lucretia and 25 years older than Fanny. She was born and raised in Johnstown, New York, some 150 miles east of Seneca Falls. She received her education from the local Johnstown Academy and a female seminary in Troy, about an hour down the road. Her father, Daniel Cady, was an attorney and state assemblyman and probably the most prominent man in town. Elizabeth learned a lot about the law from him that she would later apply to her rights campaigns. As noted above, Elizabeth and Henry Brewster Stanton were on their honeymoon at the convention in London in 1840. The progressive couple had omitted the word obey from their wedding vows. Henry was the delegate at the convention, not Elizabeth. Afterward, he continued to travel through Europe. He spoke on abolition in England, Scotland, Ireland, and France. Henry had studied law under Elizabeth's father. After he passed the bar, the couple moved to Boston, where they became engaged in the anti-slavery movement. Because of Henry's health, the couple moved to Seneca Falls in 1847, the year before Elizabeth and Lucretia's convention. As Elizabeth turned her attention toward women's rights, Henry continued to speak widely on abolition. In 1850, he became a New York state senator. Elizabeth didn't meet Susan B. Anthony until 1851, 11 years after the World Anti-Slavery Meeting and 3 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. Susan B. Anthony was born on a farm in Adams, Massachusetts, but she became an upstate New Yorker when she was 7 and her family moved to Battenville. The tiny hamlet is about 200 miles directly east of Seneca Falls and only 53 miles east of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's hometown, Johnstown. Susan's parents didn't include a middle name on her birth certificate. She added the B herself, probably referring to her aunt, Brownell. As the above letter stated, my great-grandmother Alice referred to her friend as Susan B. There is no period after the B because it is not an initial. Like for Lucretia Mott, Susan's parents were Quakers and taught her that all people were equal under God. Many of Susan's 7 brothers and sisters became abolitionists. Their father encouraged both his sons and daughters to be self-supporting, taught them business principles, and gave each child responsibilities early. Susan's parents sent her to a strict Quaker boarding school in Philadelphia, which she hated. But when her family lost their money in the Panic of 1837, she returned home. After a couple more years, like so many of the women I will tell you about, including Fanny, she became a teacher. Teaching was the only respectable occupation for women in those days, and you can only teach if you were not married. Susan's family became involved with the Unitarians when they moved to a farm in Rochester. By then, she was 25. Some of the people in the church took her to see William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, a former slave, speak on abolition. Moved by what they said, Susan joined the movement and started giving speeches herself, even though, as we mentioned, there was a social stigma against women speaking in public. But during the year of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott's convention, 1848, Susan was teaching school in Canajoharie, New York, 130 miles east of Seneca Falls, so she missed it. On the other hand, her mother and sister did attend, and 2 weeks later, when there was a women's rights convention in their Unitarian church in Rochester, Susan's father attended too. He and his wife, as well as Susan's sister, signed the Declaration for the Rights of Women that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott drafted in Seneca Falls. When a mutual friend introduced Susan and Elizabeth in 1851, Susan was 31 and Elizabeth was 36. Fanny would have been 11. It was the beginning of a 50-year partnership fighting for women's rights. Susan was better at speaking and organizing. Elizabeth was more of a philosopher and better at writing. Susan B., who would never marry, referred to Elizabeth Cady Stanton as Mrs. Stanton. Elizabeth referred to Susan as Susan. Elizabeth was homebound with 7 children. Susan could go anywhere she liked, so Elizabeth kept a room open to her in Brooklyn. New York City became their center of operations. Together, they would tackle such topics as maternity, child rearing, divorce law, married women's property rights, temperance, abolition, and presidential campaigns. Temperance was important to many in the women's rights movement because women had no way to avoid abusive, alcoholic, and overspending husbands. Charles Gordon Ames would also observe that in the Midwest, whiskey caused a lot of hardship. If you look at the problems caused by drug abuse today, you can see the parallels. But the temperance movement will dissuade many men from voting to give women the right to vote. When Fanny was 17, she entered Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, about 70 miles northeast of Cincinnati. She was there for 1 year, obtaining her teaching certificate in 1858 when she was 18. She probably couldn't have attended much longer even if she wanted to. Colleges and women's seminaries only educated women to become teachers. They didn't provide education for bachelor's degrees as they did for men. Antioch College had opened its doors only 5 years earlier in 1853. It was funded partially by the Unitarians and partly by the Christian Connection. According to the college's website, the curriculum was very progressive for its time. It afforded equal privileges to students of all religions and all races and admitted both men and women. Here's the unusual part. Antioch College taught democracy and shared governance, especially as a means of activism and social justice. That means that Fanny was formally educated to be a social activist and reformer. The school's motto, written by their first president, Horace Mann, who was still there when Fanny attended, was, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." Mann would pass away in 1859, the year after Fanny left. Horace Mann was famous as a liberal educator. He had been promoting public education all of his life. Originally from Franklin, Massachusetts, he had served as Secretary of Education for that state and as one of the representatives in the U.S. Congress. According to Wikipedia, most U.S. states adopted a version of the system Mann established in Massachusetts, especially the program for normal schools to train professional teachers. He thought that education should be universal, non-sectarian, and free. Its aims should be social efficiency, civic virtue, and character, rather than mere learning or the advancement of sectarian ends. He argued that universal public education was the best way to turn unruly American children into disciplined, judicious, Republican citizens. Horace Mann and his second wife were really good friends of Julia Ward Howe, later famous for writing the words to the song, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, and, as we mentioned, a future member of Charles Gordon Ames's congregation. Julia and her husband, Samuel Howe, had shared a honeymoon with the Manns in Europe together. So Fanny probably learned of Julia Ward Howe while at Antioch, and maybe even met her, though she was 21 years younger. By the time Fanny graduated from Antioch, the women's movement was well underway, and Julia Ward Howe was a big part of that. Fanny will focus her life on motherhood, women's rights, education for women and children, volunteering to help the urban poor, labor reform, and Unitarianism. After Antioch, she taught in Cincinnati's public schools. When the Civil War broke out, she helped for a while as a nurse, but by 1863, when she met Charles, she was back teaching in Cincinnati. Charles Gordon Ames was 12 years older than Fanny, but as we shall see, they had many things in common besides Unitarianism. He was passionate about abolition and will later become as involved in the women's rights movement as she will. Charles's first wife, Sarah Jane Daniels, had died a couple of years earlier. Their son, Charlie, was 8, and an adopted daughter named Serena was 23, the same age as Fanny. Serena had already married and was living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Charles and Sarah Jane had been living when they adopted her. Another thing that Charles and Fanny had in common, which was probably why they spent their lives helping others less fortunate than themselves, was that Charles also came from an abusive family. His birth mother conceived him out of wedlock. Her socially prominent father forced her to hand her newborn son over to foster care to avoid a family scandal. Charles's foster brothers, the real sons of his strict Calvinist foster parents, would tease him mercilessly for being born out of sin. Fanny would write, "It was a family which left him to struggle unaided and alone through that tragically desolate childhood and youth." The story of Charles's childhood and his search for his birth parents is content for a completely separate video. For now, here are the critical milestones in his life leading up to 1863 when he met Fanny. In 1828, Charles's mother, Lucy Anna Thatcher from Thomaston, Maine, gave birth to him in Dorchester near Boston. Until Charles was 3, a family in Boston cared for him. Then Thomas and Lucy Ames of Canterbury, New Hampshire, took over his care. They never formally adopted Charles, but since Charles didn't know his birth father's identity, he took the Ames surname. From age 3 to 13, he lived and worked on the Ames farm in Canterbury. When he was 14 and could legally change his guardian, he did. New England was in the middle of the Protestant revival known as the Second Great Awakening. At one of the revival camps, Charles converted to the Free Will Baptist religion. The Free Will Baptists taught that man could use his free will to choose to be a Christian or not, whereas Calvinism taught that God preordained a man's religious destiny. Charles's new guardian found him a job in Dover, New Hampshire, just 50 miles east of Canterbury. Charles worked as a printer's assistant at a newspaper that the Free Will Baptists ran called the Morning Star. The Morning Star was well known for its radical, tenacious stand against slavery. During Charles's 5 years there, he became an accomplished printer, a dedicated abolitionist, and decided to become a minister. At age 19, he traveled to Chester in southern Ohio to attend Cayuga Seminary, the Free Will Baptist Divinity School. It was established about 10 years earlier than Antioch. Like Antioch, Cayuga Seminary did not discriminate between race or gender. Future U.S. President James Garfield was in the class behind Charles. 2 years later, in 1849, Charles graduated, was ordained, and returned to Dover. At a Free Will Church meeting, he met Sarah Jane Daniels. They married in that town in March of 1850. Both were 21 years old. By August of 1850, the couple had moved to the mill town of Tamworth Carroll in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where Charles took up his first assignment. Today the town is called Chocorua. They didn't stay long. By the end of the year, they were back in Cayuga Seminary. Charles taught and Sarah Jane studied. They didn't stay there long either. A few months later, in the summer of 1851, Charles saw a promising job advertisement in the Morning Star. There was a job opening for a Free Will Baptist minister position in St. Anthony's Falls in the Minnesota Territory. The frontier town had less than 100 families living there. A few months after Charles and Sarah Jane arrived, The pioneers struck a deal with the Sioux Indians that resulted in Minneapolis's founding on the west side of the Mississippi. That is where Charles Ames established a Unitarian church and made a home for his wife. Abolition was a hot topic when ratifying new states in the West. 3 years after the Ameses moved to the Minnesota Territory, and 4 years before it became a state, a coalition of men who opposed the extension of slavery into the Western territories met in Ripon, Wisconsin, 250 miles east of the Ameses. The attendees decided to form a new political party, which would be named the Republican Party, and become the primary force fighting against slavery. They chose Abraham Lincoln of Illinois to be their first candidate. Charles must have been involved with the coalition because 2 months after the meeting in Wisconsin, the coalition held a meeting in Minneapolis to establish the Republican Party of Minnesota. They asked Charles to serve as the secretary of the meeting. One sliver of family lore claims that Charles was the one who suggested the name Republican Party. The Ameses spent 7 years in Minneapolis. While Charles attended to his new congregation, Sarah Jane ran the Sunday school. One of her students, Serena Miriam Huntley, had lost her parents and lived with a foster mom who wasn't very nice. When the foster mom wanted to take a trip, Charles and Sarah Jane offered Serena a place to stay. 14-year-old Serena was only 12 years younger than Charles and Sarah Jane. The following year, 1855, Serena's foster mom allowed the Ameses to adopt Serena formally. She became Serena Marie Ames. In June of that year, Charles and Sarah Jane had their own child. They named their son Charles Wilberforce Ames in honor of the English abolitionist William Wilberforce. But the next year, Charles had what he called a religious epiphany. He couldn't accept the free will Baptist doctrine that said unbaptized infants would suffer hellfire. Charles also couldn't agree that any sect whose baptism rituals differed from those of the Free Will Baptists were sentencing their members to perdition. Living on the frontier, Charles knew of many pioneers and all American natives who had no access to a Bible, let alone a Free Will Baptist church. How could they be damned simply at the fault of ignorance? Charles felt he must shed those doctrines, which meant he had to leave the Free Will Baptist Church. He would spend the next 3 years in religious limbo trying to figure out which church suited him better. In the meantime, he took a job as the Register of Deeds for Minnesota. He was the first Register of Deeds for that state. It was a 2-year commitment. By the time those 2 years were up, Sarah Jane, Serena, and 4-year-old Charlie were in Maine, taking care of Sarah Jane's ailing mother and sister. Sarah Jane, who was on the same religious page as Charles, had spent some of her time on the East Coast visiting family in Boston. She was entranced by the Unitarian and Transcendentalist movements centered there. She wrote to Charles about being uplifted by popular Unitarian orators, Starr King and Theodore Parker's speeches. She was also reading the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Serena was equally excited about the philosophies. Charles decided to say goodbye to Minneapolis and join Sarah Jane, Charlie, and Serena in Maine. Sarah Jane soon introduced Charles to her new Boston friends, and by March of 1859, the whole family, including Sarah Jane's mother, had moved to the suburb of Somerville. By then, Charles and Sarah Jane were 30 years old, Serena was 19, and Charlie was almost 5. I'm going to end this video here because the next video will be a packed one. I will introduce you to all the extraordinary people Charles and Sarah Jane got to meet in Boston in 1859. These will be the people surrounding Charles when he marries Fanny Baker 4 years later. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you liked this video. Subscribing costs absolutely nothing and gives me clout on YouTube. so that would be helpful too. And if you click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button, then you will get an email when I post the next video. Bye!